Good morning, it's bright and early here at Avebury Stone Circle. It's still 10 minutes before sunrise, and I've taken a couple of pictures of the stones against the brightening sky so far. My current exposure settings are 2 seconds at f16, and I'm using my 17 to 40mm zoom and a 0.9 ND grad to hold back the exposure on the brightening sky. The sun will be rising over the horizon very shortly, so I've just recomposed my image to look along the row of the stones on the stone circle, so that when the sun does rise I get the morning light side lighting the stones. So I've just finished my dawn shoot at Avebury Stone Circle, and I've been really lucky this morning because although the sky is fairly clear, a little bit of high level cloud adding a bit of interest to the sky. They're not any big puffy white clouds, so that's the kind of thing I normally like to see on landscape pictures, but you can't always guarantee that. However, I've been quite lucky this morning because there's been quite a lot of mist around, really low level mist as the sun comes up, and then it got a little bit worse and then a little bit better, and so I kept shooting all the way through, and hopefully we'll get some good pictures. Done a couple of shots with HDR as well, so wherever I put the camera, I composed about 3 or 4 different images, and on each of those I took a sequence of pictures to convert into HDR. So there's about 10, 12 shots per HDR image that I plan to convert. Might not necessarily use all of them, but better to have them in the camera and decide later on the computer than not at all. And also, on the last series of images, just as the light was beginning to get too strong, too high a contrast, I chose to use my infrared filter for one shot, and also I changed out my ND grad for my circular polarizer. So we'll get those on the computer and take a look and see how they come out. So all in all, a successful shoot, and I'll get them back onto Aperture on the iMac and take a look at some editing. So following my photo shoot at Avebury Stone Circle, I've now imported all of my photographs into Aperture 3 on the Mac. I've chosen 3 sets of images. 2 of them are singled out for HDR conversion, and one of them I'm just going to process as a single image. Starting with this one here, this is in Aperture 3 a stack of 3 images. What I did is I set this one up on the 5D Mark II to take some bracketed shots. And the way mine is set up is that I get a normal image as the first one, and then the second image is 2 stops underexposed, and the third image is 2 stops overexposed. So those 3 images I'm going to convert into HDR using NIK Software plugins for Aperture 3, so specifically HDR Effects Pro 2. So I'm going to select all 3 images and right click and edit with plugin and HDR Effects Pro 2. Aperture 3 now prepares the 3 images from a RAW file into a TIFF image, and it does that for all 3, which is then exported into the NIK Software plugin. HDR Effects Pro 2 now loads the images, but in doing so it also creates copies, so the originals are left untouched. There's the image in very simple edited terms. It's still not anywhere near the complete image, but what we can do is select which image we want to use as the ghost reference if appropriate, and on this image there's no real need to do that. The alignment I'm always going to tick, even though this is shot on a tripod, just to make sure there wasn't any even remotest slight movement when I pressed the shutter, even though I was using a shutter release cable. And the ghost reduction I'm always going to leave switched on as well. Strength I tend to leave at 100% as well. Chromatic aberration I'm not going to bother with because this can be corrected later. So now these three images are selected, I've imported them, and I'm going to create the HDR. HDR FX Pro 2 now aligns the exposures and applies the ghost reduction. And then it spends a little time merging exposures into our HDR image. The full HDR FX Pro 2 window opens with the main editing space in the centre of the screen. And there's a preset library, custom, imported, and historical references to filters on the left and recipes. And on the right are the actual filter controls. So I'm just going to choose a very quick edit on this one, just to use the recipes which are already programmed into HDR FX Pro. So just quickly looking at the images on the left, you get to see a fairly good idea of what things you can do with HDR FX Pro. For example, you can choose a dramatic image, which is not my cup of tea. I prefer the more realistic, more photorealistic images. So I'm going to choose on this one number 8, which is dark. Get a really good picture of the sky there, really orange. That's almost exactly how it looked that morning when I shot the picture. The only thing is, I think it's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to change the exposure and just bring it up by around 10%. And I'm quite happy with that. There are just a couple of little dust spots on here. I can't correct those in HDR FX Pro, so I'm happy with that image. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to press save. The plugin saves the image, and we return to Aperture 3. So our three images in Aperture 3 remain untouched. So I'm going to close that stack, and we can see that our new image has been given the suffix HDR by the plugin software. So just to quickly finish this picture off, I'm just going to go into Adjustments in Aperture, and first of all I'm going to correct the chromatic aberration, which is quite apparent just here on the right hand side of the big stone. I'm going to bring up my loop, and we can see that there is some significant red fringing. So going to add adjustment, chromatic aberration, and just start to correct that red fringing. And there we go. I think we've pretty much removed all of the fringing. So I'll get rid of the loop, and the one final thing to do is to do a retouch, repair, automatically chosen, and I'm just going to remove these dust spots which were on the sensor of my 5D Mark II. And moving on to the next image, I'm going to do another HDR conversion. This one's a little bit more complex. Instead of 3 images, this is those 3 images were, as I explained earlier, taken with exposure bracketing automatically, but these images are 7 which I took manually. So each one of these was changed by 1 stop. The aperture was kept constant, and the shutter speed was changed completely manually. So I'm going to select these 7 images, and once again right click, edit with plugin, and HDR FX Pro 2. I can choose my ghost reference image. Alignment is ticked, ghost reduction is ticked at 100%, and I will correct the chromatic aberration later, and click on Create HDR. So there is the HDR processed image from the 7 selected pictures that we imported. It's not really the look I'm after, so this time I'm going to process the final image manually by working my way down on the list of settings on the right hand side of the screen. I'm going to increase the tone compression up to around just less than 50%. And method strength I'm going to leave at around 50%. The HDR method I prefer strong and detail realistic. I prefer not to use the grungy feel or the detailed feel. I think that's too false looking. Like I said before, I prefer the photorealistic options. Accentuated is just about okay, but I prefer the realistic. And drama, I'm going to choose deep. Moving on to tonality, I'm going to leave pretty much everything exactly where it is. The contrast I'm going to take down just a tad, and the blacks I'm going to move up to 100%, and the whites I'm going to move up to about halfway, around just over 50%. Now I think it's lacking in a little bit of saturation, so I'm going to kick that up to around 11 or 12%. Quite happy with that. So the image looks pretty good as a whole. I'm quite happy with what we've done so far. So moving on to the finishing tab, I'm going to leave everything switched off on 0, 50 and 0. But what I'm going to do on the levels and curves is select neutral and RGB, and I'm just going to add a very gentle S-curve just to boost up the contrast. And there we go. I think that's my final image. I'm quite happy with that. Just a little speck of dirt up here on the sensor, and a dust spot just here as well, which I can correct in, and another one there in Aperture. So I'm happy with that. That to me is, although it's an HDR image, it's very photorealistic. There's no grain or grungy feeling to the photo, which is the kind of HDR effect I prefer. So I'll press save, and we'll save the image and move back into Aperture 3 just to finish off the image. Moving on to the final image. This one is going to be processed as a single image. So this time, instead of using HDR Effects Pro, I'm going to use Color Effects Pro. So first of all, what I need to do with this image is to get some more details. So there is a good filter here called Detail Extractor. Going to select the Detail Extractor, and as you can see already, it's vastly improved the photograph. So if I compare it to the original, there's just no detail in the stone at all, in the rock, and now there is, and the grass texture and the sky. The sky's blown out in the original, and on there it's a little bit more orange where the sun is coming over the horizon. So already, without even having made any adjustments, this picture is already improved in my opinion. Now we're going to add another filter, and this time I'm going to choose tonal contrast, and again we can make some adjustments to the image on the right hand side. Going to just decrease the saturation slightly because it's a little bit too much. Going to add one more filter, and this time it's the lens vignette. Now that just looks too much to me, so the amount I'm going to reduce to around 17%. That I think I'm happy with, so I'm going to save the image there and return back to Aperture 3. And I hope that helps. I hope that's given you a little insight into my photo editing workflow through Aperture and the NIK Software plugins. Thanks for watching, and see you again.